you ever looked at your own life and thought, I did everything I was told, but why do I still feel so empty? You've followed the path. You've been responsible. You've held yourself together through seasons that nearly destroyed you. You've smiled when you didn't feel like it. You've shown up when all you wanted was to disappear. You've been strong, maybe too strong. And yet, something still aches inside you. Not a sharp pain, but a quiet, constant hollowness. A sense that you've somehow abandoned something essential, but you can't name what it is. It shows up in the pauses between obligations, in the silence after the screen goes black, in the moments when no one is watching and you don't have to pretend. Carl Jung believed this ache was not random, not a symptom of failure, but the beginning of a sacred crisis. He said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. We are conditioned to see emotional suffering as a mistake, as something to fix, medicate, or push away. But what if it's not a problem? What if it's a message? What if your sadness is not weakness, but memory? What if your emptiness is not a void, but a map? What if your anxiety is not dysfunction, but a whisper from your unlived life?" Most people don't listen, because listening requires slowing down, turning inward, sitting still long enough to feel what's been buried. And that's terrifying. So instead, we perform, we become efficient, we become impressive, we become productive, and in doing so, we become strangers to ourselves. We forget who we were before we were taught to be useful. We forget what we loved before we were told what mattered. We forget how to breathe without the pressure to become someone. Jung called this forgetting a loss of soul, not in a spiritual sense, but in a psychological one. The self, our true center, becomes eclipsed by the roles we play, the masks we wear, the expectations we inherit. And one day, we realize we're not living, we're performing. We don't speak our truth. We manage impressions. We don't rest, we collapse. We don't connect. We please, but the soul doesn't disappear. It waits, it watches, it mourns. And when the gap between your outer life and inner truth grows too wide, you begin to break. Not because you are weak, but because you've reached the threshold where adaptation becomes betrayal. You are not broken, you are breaking open. Jung believed this moment was not a failure, but a necessary stage of individuation. Individuation is not about self-improvement. It's not about fixing what's wrong. It's the process of becoming who you truly are, beneath the conditioning, the persona, the survival strategies. It begins when you stop asking, "How do I get better?" and start asking, "Who am I really?" Not the version of you that smiles through exhaustion, not the one who achieves to be worthy, not the one who makes everyone comfortable, but the version of you that's been waiting to be reclaimed. The one who cries easily, who dreams wildly, who feels deeply, who was told at some point, too much, too sensitive, too intense. So you buried that self to belong, and you wore a mask to survive. And the world applauded that mask, but now the applause feels hollow, and your soul aches for air. This is the beginning of healing. Not the tidy kind, not the pretty kind, but the real kind, where truth begins to outrun performance. You start to question what you've always accepted. You start to notice how often you say yes to things that drain you, how often you silence your truth to keep the peace, how often you betray your needs just to feel needed. And you realize, this isn't who I am. This is who I became to be safe. There is grief in this realization. Grief for all the versions of you that were shaped by fear. Grief for the parts of you that went unloved. Grief for the life you could have lived if you were allowed to stay whole. But this grief is sacred. It is the doorway to remembrance. Because the soul does not return through logic. It returns through feeling. You may find yourself crying without knowing why, longing for something you can't name, feeling restless in spaces that once felt familiar. You may look in the mirror and not recognize who you've become. And that's okay. That's the point. This is not a breakdown, this is a breakthrough. You're shedding the layers of false self. You're hearing the voice that's been whispering beneath the noise. Jung wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart." Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens. You are awakening, not all at once, not without resistance, but steadily. And in this awakening, you begin to reclaim your anger, no longer shameful but clarifying, your needs, no longer burdens but boundaries, your sadness, no longer weakness but wisdom. Everything you were taught to suppress is exactly what will lead you home. Not to a better version of you, but to the real one. You don't need to add anything. You need to return. Because you were never meant to be perfect. You were meant to be whole. There comes a moment, quiet but unmistakable, when the world you've built no longer fits the person you're becoming. It might look fine from the outside. You still show up. You still smile. You still meet expectations. But deep down, something has changed. The things that used to comfort you now feel empty. The roles you used to play now feel forced. The mask you wore so skillfully begins to suffocate. This is not failure. It's evolution. Carl Jung believed that healing often begins when life no longer makes sense, when the outer world becomes misaligned with your inner truth, and you can no longer pretend it doesn't hurt. The pain isn't random. It's your soul trying to pull you back to yourself. And yet, this is where most people panic, because when the old identity starts to fall apart, there's nothing familiar left to hold on to. You don't know what to say in conversations anymore. You don't know what to want. You don't know what to pursue. You just know you can't go back. It's disorienting and lonely, but it's necessary. Jung described this space as the beginning of individuation, a threshold between who you've been and who you're meant to become. But to cross that threshold, you must face what you've spent years avoiding. You must look inward, into the hidden chambers of your own psyche, the ones filled with emotion, memory, and truth. Not all of it will be beautiful. You'll find wounds you never knew were there, anger you've swallowed for decades, dreams you buried because someone said they were unrealistic. You'll meet the child inside you who never felt safe to speak, who learned to adapt in exchange for love, who silenced their own needs just to stay close to others. And as you meet these parts of yourself, a strange thing happens. You begin to feel more alive, because feeling pain is still better than feeling nothing. So many people live in a state of emotional numbness, not because they lack feeling, but because they've carried too much for too long. They've become skilled at surviving, at functioning, at performing strength, but they've forgotten how to feel. They've confused being numb with being healed, calm with peace, obedience with wisdom. This is where the journey inward becomes unavoidable, because once the soul awakens, it refuses to go back to sleep. You begin to question everything. Why do I keep saying yes when I mean no? Why do I stay silent when I want to speak? Why do I seek approval from people who don't even know me? And beneath all those questions is a deeper one. Why did I abandon myself? This is not self-blame. It's self-remembering. You're not punishing yourself for past decisions. You're finally becoming conscious of how those decisions were made. You did what you had to do to survive. You adapted. You became what others needed. You silenced your chaos to keep the peace. You became strong because you had no other choice. But now, you're being invited to choose differently. You no longer need to live in reaction. You can live in alignment, but alignment requires truth. And truth is rarely comfortable. Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul, because the soul doesn't speak in logic. It speaks in symbols, dreams, synchronicities, longings that make no sense on paper, emotions that defy control. To live in harmony with the soul, you must unlearn everything you were taught about control. You must learn how to listen, not just to your thoughts, but to your body, your emotions, your quiet knowing. You begin to notice how certain people make your chest tighten, how certain environments drain your energy, how certain words, no matter how well-meaning, cut like knives. And slowly, you begin to honor those signals. You walk away from conversations that no longer feel honest. You say no without apology. You rest when your body says it's time, not when the schedule says it's allowed. This is how the real self begins to emerge, not through declarations, but through small, consistent acts of integrity. You stop trying to impress. You start trying to feel. You stop chasing validation. You start following resonance. It might confuse the people around you. They'll say you've changed, that you're distant, that you're selfish. But what they're really saying is, I no longer recognize the version of you that kept me comfortable. And that's okay. You didn't come here to make everyone else feel safe. You came here to remember who you are. That will require loss. Loss of illusions, loss of approval, loss of the old self you once needed to survive. But what you gain in return is peace, not the kind that comes from everything being okay, but the kind that comes from no longer lying to yourself. You begin to feel rooted, not in certainty, but in authenticity. You stop trying to become and start trying to be. Carl Jung said, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries." You don't heal by becoming someone new. You heal by embracing the parts of you that have long been exiled. The sad part, the scared part, the jealous part, the wild part, the intuitive part, the quiet part, the part that always knew. You stop labeling them as flaws. You start listening to them as messengers. And with every part you welcome home, your energy changes. You speak slower. You breathe deeper. You stop rushing to explain. You stop apologizing for taking up space. And without even trying, you begin to attract different people, different experiences, a different rhythm, not because the world has changed, but because you have. You've returned to yourself. There comes a stillness, a silence that follows the storm of awakening. You've looked into your pain. You've questioned the roles. You've started to say no. You've stepped away from what no longer feels real. But now, you're here. In the quiet. In the space between the mask and the soul. In the pause before the next chapter begins. And it's unsettling, because you're not sure who you are without the old stories, without the people who needed your performance, without the identities that gave you structure, approval, and a place to stand. You're not broken, but you're not quite whole yet either. This is what Jung called the tension of opposites, a sacred liminal space where the false self dissolves and the true self waits to be born. No one talks about this part, the part where you're no longer surviving, but not yet fully living, where the patterns have stopped but the peace hasn't quite arrived, where you've let go of who you were but haven't yet become who you're meant to be. And in that space, the shadow shows up again, not to punish, but to offer integration. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. You begin to see yourself more clearly than ever, not just the gentle parts, but the sharp ones. The part of you that wants to control, the part that seeks validation, the part that still longs to be chosen. And the old reaction is to fix it, to try to be better, to rise above. But that's not the path anymore. The new path is about inclusion, letting all of you belong. Not just your light, but your longing. Not just your wisdom, but your wounds. You realize the shadow is not the enemy. It's the map. It shows you where love was once withheld, where your needs went unmet, where you learned to become quiet in order to feel safe. And now you have a choice: to exile those parts again, or to bring them home. This is what individuation truly means. It's not about becoming perfect. It's not about mastering life. It's not about shedding pain forever. It's about becoming whole. To stand in the middle of all your contradictions and say, this too is part of me. The part that doubts. The part that hides. The part that lashes out when afraid. The part that still wants to be held. You stop trying to transcend your humanity. You start trying to love it. And in that love, a quiet transformation unfolds. You don't suddenly become happy all the time, but you become present. You don't stop feeling pain, but you stop fearing it. You don't avoid discomfort. You move with it, slowly, consciously, gently. You begin to notice the smallest things, how sunlight lands differently on your skin, how silence no longer feels threatening, how being alone feels more like spaciousness than punishment, how your breath deepens without you trying, and without even realizing it. You've begun to live from your center, not your ego, not your wounds, not your mask, but yourself, the one who has been waiting, not to be improved, but to be remembered. Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. That privilege is not given, it's earned through honesty, loss, and surrender. You lose the old mirrors. You surrender the need to be understood. You give up the illusion of perfection, and in return you gain something priceless. Peace that isn't performative, presence that doesn't need approval, wholeness that doesn't depend on anyone else seeing it. You stop living to be loved and start loving to live. And from this place, relationships change. You no longer attract from scarcity. You no longer seek people to complete you. You begin to resonate with those who see you as you are, not because of what you offer, but because of what you reflect. Your clarity becomes your compass. Your boundaries become second nature. You no longer explain your worth. You embody it. The world doesn't get louder. Your inner world gets calmer. You stop chasing the next breakthrough. You begin to live the integration, because healing isn't an event. It's a rhythm, a remembering, a returning. And the more you return to yourself, the less you fear the silence, the less you fear solitude, the less you fear simply being, not always knowing, not always doing, not always fixing, just being. And in that being, you find something sacred, a self that doesn't need to be convinced, a truth that doesn't need to be sold, a life that doesn't need to be defended. You are not broken. You are becoming. You are not failing. You are unfolding. You are not too late. You are right on time. And now you stand at the edge of a new way of living, not based on effort, but on essence, not driven by fear, but drawn by alignment, not rooted in approval, but in authenticity. This is your beginning, not the one that starts when everything is figured out, but the one that begins when you realize you don't have to figure it all out to move forward. Take a breath. Let that truth settle. You are already whole, not because everything makes sense, but because you are no longer pretending, not because you're perfect, but because you are present. And that is enough. So before you go, ask yourself gently, what part of you has returned through this reflection? What truth has begun to rise from the silence? What insight has your soul whispered, even if just for a second? Write it in the comments, not for attention, but as an act of devotion to the self that's been waiting. And then keep watching the next video in this series to let this remembering deepen, to keep walking this path toward yourself, to honor what was awakened. Your insight matters, not just to you, but to someone out there still in the dark, waiting for a voice that sounds like theirs. Thank you for listening. And more than that, thank you for remembering. You are not broken. You are just not finished becoming whole.